All right. Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to PPA 555 Public Budgeting and Finance. My name is Dr. Powell, and we'll go ahead and get started for the evening. We have 15 people in the class, and so right now it looks like we don't quite have everyone, but we have most everyone so far. So I'm sure a couple of your colleagues will be joining as we progress, but 6 o'clock, so I thought we'd go ahead and get started. Nice seeing everyone tonight. I'm glad the link worked for you, and I look forward to working with you over the next 6 weeks. It is a summer class, and so it is kind of unusual. We only have 6 weeks together, and because of Memorial Day next Monday, we really only have 5 Monday sessions. And so instead of our normal 6 sessions, we only have 5. So we do have a lot of information that we have to pack into these 6 weeks. It certainly is doable. I've been teaching this budgeting course in the summer for many years now, and so it fits pretty nicely in a 6 week variety. We also teach our budgeting course in the distance learning MPA program, which is also a 6 week course. So it's been designed around 6 weeks, and I'm sure we can get all of our material in, even though we only have 5 live Zoom sessions. I'm not going to go through the roster because I don't require attendance in these sessions. I do strongly recommend it. All these sessions, though, will be recorded, and I will put the recordings up on our Beachboard site so you can have access to them throughout the week if you would like. Usually we'll be able to get the recording up on the Beachboard site by sometime Tuesday morning, and then it'll be available for you to watch at your leisure. I thought what we would do tonight, because we only have 5 sessions instead of 6, we do need to cover some substantive information tonight. We can't just all leave it for next week because we don't have class next week. So what I thought we would do is kind of split tonight's session up into 2 different sections. First part of the class, we will cover the syllabus, the course requirements, talk about the types of assignments you'll be doing, how you'll do them, why you're doing them. Then take a break, and then the second half of class, we'll get into some of our substantive information. We'll talk about an introduction to public finance and budgeting, and we'll also talk about, if we have time, the budgeting process. Then the material that's on the syllabus for next week, we'll then push that material to 2 weeks from tonight, and we'll do budget formats and analysis and accounting and all that good information then in 2 weeks. So that's the plan for tonight. We'll see how we progress and see how much time we have. I think we should be able to do all of that within 2.5 hours without a whole lot of trouble. So hopefully you can see my screen. I'm sharing the syllabus. You probably had a chance to go onto the Beachboard site and review the syllabus already, but I just want to go through the syllabus and some of the highlights of the course. So we're all familiar with what we're doing, and we know that going into the course, and so answer a few questions tonight on the course and some of the assignments. Now, you've probably already heard that the university is going to be transitioning from Beachboard to Canvas. That's going to be happening over the next year. So if you're still in the program next summer, if you haven't graduated by then, all courses next summer will be migrated to Canvas, and Beachboard will then become inoperable as of next summer. But between now and next summer, faculty members have a choice as to whether they want to teach in Beachboard or Canvas. This summer, obviously, we're going to be sticking with Beachboard for this class, but do be aware that beginning in the fall and next spring, some of your instructors may start migrating some of their teaching onto Canvas instead of Beachboard, because that's where the university will be going over the next year or so. But for us, for this summer, we're still using Beachboard the way we've always used it before. So let me run through the syllabus and just cover some of the highlights for you. As I said, my name is Dr. Powell. I just wrapped up my 21st year on faculty here in the Graduate Center for Public Policy Administration. Before I came here to Cal State Long Beach, I taught in Florida at Florida Gulf Coast University and taught for 4 years in the Political Science Department at Eastern Illinois University in Charleston, Illinois. So I guess overall, I've been teaching now for 26 years. I'm entering my 27th year as a full-time faculty member. So been doing this for a while, been teaching budgeting in the summer for probably the past 10 or 11 years. Really started teaching budgeting back in 1996 when I first started teaching at Eastern Illinois. So again, been at this for a while. You all know our meeting schedule. We meet live in Zoom on Monday evenings at 6 o'clock. We're scheduled 6 until 8:45. Some evenings we'll use up the vast majority of that time. Other evenings we may not go past 8:30. It really depends upon the topic and what we are covering on that evening. Again, we only have 5 live Zoom sessions tonight, June 6th, June 13th, June 20th, and then June 27th. The course officially then ends on July 1st. So a nice compact 6-week type of schedule. My office phone number is on there, my office email. I am working virtually this summer, so I'm not going to be on campus very often at all. So if you need to contact me, the best way to contact me is either via email, or I also have a questions forum that I've created on our Beachboard site. If you have any general course-related questions that aren't necessarily specific to you or on private types of questions, you can post those in the questions forum, and everyone can then participate in that questions forum, and I'll respond to those questions in that forum. If you do have something that relates directly to you or more private in nature, do feel free to send me an email, and I'll respond very quickly. I have all my emails sent to my phone, so you'll probably get a response, or you should get a response, certainly within 24 hours. Phone, it's not a great way to contact me because I won't be in the office much this summer. So by all means, use email over voicemail. Now, as you all know, this is public budgeting and finance. It is one of the core requirements of the MPA program. And I know most of the folks in this class are in the MPA program. I know we have a few folks who are not in the MPA program, but this is one of those core courses in the MPA program. So for everyone who's in the program, when you get to the end of the program, you're in 697 directed research, you're doing your 5 case studies. One of those 5 case studies you'll be doing as your culminating experience will be a public budgeting and finance case study. So this course is really designed to try and prepare you to do well on that case study as one of your exit requirements from the MPA program. To be in this class, obviously, we do have a course prerequisite, and that is you have completed either PPA 518, which is microeconomics, or a microeconomics at the undergraduate level or at the community college level, so either Econ 101, Econ 300, or some microeconomics course at a community college or another university certainly suffice to get you a permit to get into this course. If for some reason you haven't met that prerequisite for the course and you want to remain in the course, by all means do so. Don't tell me you don't have the prerequisite met, and what I don't know won't hurt me. So you can certainly still stay in the course. The reason why there's a microeconomics prerequisite is just to make sure you have a little bit of prior knowledge on microeconomics and public finance before coming into this course. Dr. Moore, who is our budgeting core content person, believes it's essential for this course. I'm a little less convinced that it's as essential as probably Dr. Moore thinks it is, but you should have that prerequisite. If you don't tell me, and it'll be fine. The course, though, is really oriented around public budgeting and finance. And so we're going to recognize the fact that budgets exist in the public, private, and the nonprofit sectors. What we're really focusing on in this class is we're focusing on public sector budgeting. We will touch a little bit on nonprofit budgeting. We'll talk about some different types of fund-based accounting we tend to see in nonprofit organizations. We'll mention things like, FASB as well as GASB, but for the most part, we're looking at governmental budgeting. And we're going to highlight some of the differences between how budgets are constructed and implemented in the public sector as compared to how they're constructed and implemented in private corporations. We will cover all of the salient elements of public budgeting. So we'll talk about how budgets are constructed, what budgets look like, their budget formats. We'll talk about principles of governmental accounting. We'll talk about revenue generation, where revenue comes from, and the advantages and disadvantages of different revenue sources. We'll talk about the difference between operating budgets and capital budgets and how we develop our capital budgets for the purpose of funding public infrastructure. We'll talk about how we pay for those capital projects with things like bonds and debt mechanisms. We'll talk about intergovernmental fiscal relations. So it's really kind of an overview survey-oriented course to expose you to all the basic principles of public budgeting and finance. Now, for those of you who are currently enrolled in the MPA program, I'm sure that you attended the orientation when you first joined the program. And at that orientation, there was probably a discussion of our program as a nationally accredited program. We have national accreditation through an organization called NASPA, which is the Network of Schools of Public Policy Affairs and Administration. They changed their name a few years ago. It's a little unwieldy the way in which it is now, but they go by the acronym NASPA. And NASPA is the organization that accredits all graduate public affairs programs, primarily Masters of Public Administration, Masters of Public Policy, and Masters of Public Affairs programs across the country. I think there are about, at last count, about 100, maybe about 120 or so accredited MPA programs, and we are one of them. We have been continuously accredited by NASPA since the 1980s, and we are currently going through our reaccreditation process, and that will run through next June. But as an accredited program, we need to teach certain universal required competencies so that whenever anyone graduates from a NASPA accredited program, they will graduate with 5 universal competencies that, everyone who graduates from a NASPA program will have those competencies. Those competencies are to, number 1, lead and manage in public interest. Number 2, to participate in and contribute to the policy process. Number 3, to analyze, synthesize, think critically, solve problems, and make evidence-informed decisions in a complex and dynamic environment. Number 4, to articulate, apply, and advance a public sector perspective. And number 5, to communicate, interact productively in culturally responsive ways with a diverse and changing workforce and society at large. So all of our core courses, in one way or another, will address some of those universal competencies. In this course, we have identified primarily universal required competency number 1, to lead and manage, and number 3, to analyze, synthesize, think critically, and solve problems. That's where this course contributes to those 2 primary universal competencies. So what I've done for you is in the syllabus, I've taken our specific course-based objectives, and I have then tied those to either to lead and manage or to analyze, synthesize, and think critically, those 2 universal competencies. So as you'll see under course objectives, by the conclusion of the course, you should be able to, number 1, correctly identify budget formats, and that's related to the lead and manage universal competencies. Because if you're going to lead and manage in a public organization, you need to be able to identify budget formats. Number 2, objective for the course, to evaluate the fiscal solvency of a local government. You will get the opportunity to select a city in Southern California, review its budget, and review its comprehensive annual financial report. And based upon the review of those 2 documents, you will be able to assess that city's fiscal solvency. Again, that's analysis, that's universal competency number 3. Third course-based competency, to analyze sources of revenue. We'll spend a week and a half to 2 weeks talking about revenue and their advantages and disadvantages. Number 4, articulate the need for fund-based accounting and different accounting methods. We'll talk about how accounting works in the public sector versus the private sector and why the need for differences between the 2 sectors. We'll talk about how to evaluate comprehensive financial reports. Again, you'll be reviewing a comprehensive annual financial report. A lot of cities have now changed the name, so it's no longer a CAFR. Now it's an annual comprehensive financial reports. Now it's an ACFR. It's the same document, they're just using a different acronym for it. You'll be able to evaluate one of those for your city, to analyze different types of debt mechanisms and capital budgeting, and then finally to create budgets based on assignment requirements. Any good budgeting course worth its salt will have an assignment whereby you will need to prepare a budget. Because whenever you leave a public budgeting course in an MPA program, at the very minimum, you should be able to prepare a simple line item budget using Excel. You'll get some experience doing that here in this course. So those are our course objectives and how they relate to the overall universal required competencies in the MPA program. Now, as you know, this is a 6-week course. It's what we consider to be an online hybrid course in that we meet live in synchronous sessions on Monday evenings, with the exception of next Monday. And then you have an asynchronous component to the course, which consists of a discussion board. So each week you'll then be posting in a discussion board that will be your asynchronous component. So we're both synchronous as well as asynchronous. The course is really split up into 2 parts. In the first segment of the course, we're going to deal with the basics of how to prepare a budget. We'll talk about basics of budget analysis. We'll talk about processes, budget formats, capital budgeting, debt management. That will all be in the first half of the course. Then the second segment of the course will look primarily at revenues and expenditures. We'll talk about the structure and politics of various taxes, advantages and disadvantages of each type of tax. We've really kind of designed this course to have a nice logical flow to it. So every week builds upon the preceding week. So it's important that you're either here or you're reviewing the recording, so you're up to speed on the material from the preceding week, because that material will then form the building block for the material for the next week. Since we are only a 6-week course, I don't want to overwhelm you with readings, and so we only have one real required textbook, and that's John Mikesell's Fiscal Administration. I say you can use any edition because the substance of the book is essentially the same across editions. The only difference is some newer editions obviously will have some more contemporary examples. Unfortunately, Dr. Mikesell passed away in 2019, and so the most recent edition is going to probably be the last, certainly be the last edition from Dr. Mikesell, but it's an excellent textbook in that I think it covers all the material for the course very well. I've searched high and low for many years to find what I consider to be better textbooks than Fiscal Administration, and I simply have not been able to find them. So that's why we're using the Fiscal Administration textbook. If you get an earlier edition, you can probably get it a lot cheaper than a more contemporary edition, 10th or 11th edition. So feel free, if you want to save some money, you can get a previous edition. They're also available for rent as well on a variety of different websites. And so if you want to rent it, you can do that. Leave it completely up to you. I will not be teaching directly from the Mikesell textbook. I like to present material in a different way than John Mikesell presents in the textbook. So we're really looking at the textbook as being some background information, background material that's important that you read and have a handle on. But we may cover material a little bit differently in our Monday night sessions. So it's not going to be everything coming completely from the textbook, but I do highly recommend the textbook. I think it's one of the best books that you can get for a survey-oriented budgeting course like what we do here in PPA 555. Everyone's always concerned about the evaluation criteria, and I understand that. And so I try and give you as many specifics as I possibly can about the types of assignments you'll be doing, when they're due, and what they're comprised of. So basically what you'll be doing in this course over the 6 weeks is you'll be preparing a pre-instructional assignment, a post-instructional assignment, a final examination, and then 5 graded beach board postings. So first off, for the pre-instructional assignment, if you've been in the NPA program for a while, then you're familiar with the fact that for each one of our core courses, budgeting, human resource management, organization theory, policy analysis, and research methods, each one of those core courses will have what we consider to be a pre-instructional and a post-instructional assignment. Pre-instructional assignment comes in near the beginning of the course. Post-instructional assignment comes in at the end of the course. The purpose is obviously for assessment. So we can see how you perform on the pre-instructional, and then you'll get a similar post-instructional, and we can then compare your performance to try and determine what you have learned and the type of information you have gleaned over the course itself. For the pre-instructional assignment, you are not to use any material from the course. So don't use the Mikesell textbook. Don't use any of the PowerPoint slides I've provided on Beachboard. Don't use any recordings. Just all you use for the pre-instructional assignment is what you currently know about public budgets. Then in the post-instructional assignment, you are then free to use all the information that you have acquired throughout your time in the class. So for the pre-instructional, just use what you currently know about budgets. So let me introduce you to the pre-instructional assignment. Then I'll introduce you to the post-instructional assignment after that. If we scroll all the way down in the syllabus to almost the very end of the syllabus, you'll see that I provided some specific instructions for how to do the pre-instructional as well as the post-instructional assignment. The pre-instructional assignment essentially requires that you obtain a copy of a budget from a city here in Southern California. Now, if you are outside of Southern California, I don't know if anyone is, but if you're outside of Southern California, you want to use a city outside of Southern California, that should be fine. Just let me know in advance. But the vast majority of folks in the class will choose a city from Southern California. Go to the city's website, and you should be able to obtain an electronic copy of the budget. Just about every city now on their website has a copy of their budget. So much easier to get a budget today than it used to be 10, 15, 20 years ago. So you'll obtain a budget from a city here in Southern California, and you'll read through that budget. And then based upon your reading of that budget in the pre-instructional assignment, you will provide answers to 8 simple questions. And I've got those 8 questions listed here on the screen for you. So the first question is, what type of budget format is represented by your city's budget? Now, if you've dealt with budgets before, you may be familiar with the different types of budget formats. If you haven't dealt with budgets before, then you probably don't know what these budget formats are yet. If you've never dealt with budgets before, you don't know what budget formats are, a legitimate answer to this question on the pre-instructional assignment is, I do not have the information to answer this question. And that's fine. The pre-instructional is just an honest assessment by you of how you can answer these questions as you enter the course. I don't anticipate that you will be able to answer the questions, all the questions, upon entering the course, and that's absolutely fine. I know some folks come into the course with no experience in public budgeting whatsoever. I've had in the past, in the distance learning program, I had one gentleman who came into the class from MTA, and he was in charge of their capital budget. So his part of the capital budget was he was managing $500 million in capital projects on an annual basis. He had a lot of information about budgeting coming into the course, so he could answer these questions. If you don't have that type of experience, you may not be able to answer the question. So if you don't know anything about budget formats, question 1, you can say, I do not have the information to answer that question. But what type of budget format do you think it is? And then question 2, what information did you use to arrive at that answer? So if you're going to tell me, I think that this is a line item budget, then in number 2, tell me, what information did you use to decide that this was a line item budget? Now, again, if you don't have the information to answer question 1, then the same rule applies for question 2. You can say, I don't have the information to answer that question. Question 3, what are the strengths of this type of budget? So, for example, is it easy to follow? Is it commonsensical and intuitive? What are some of the advantages? What are some of the strengths of the budget format that you are looking at? Number 4, what are some of the weaknesses of this type of budget? Question number 5 is a question that I think everyone can answer. Even if you don't have any experience in budgeting, you can answer questions 5 and 6. Question 5, what are the 3 major sources of revenue for the city? So what I want you to do is I want you to look through the budget and find the top 3 revenue sources. Now, for a lot of cities, the number 1 revenue source is probably going to be property taxation. For some other cities, especially if they're a very tourist-heavy type of city, you may see hotel taxes, or what in California we call transient occupancy taxes. That may be the primary source of revenue for your city if it's a tourist city. For some cities, it might be user fees and user charges might be the primary source of revenue. But find the top 3 sources of revenue and then provide a very simple table for me. In that very simple table, in the first column, you'll tell me the source of revenue, so property tax or hotel tax or whatever they are. the top three sources of revenue. Then the second column, tell me how much revenue the city is deriving from each one of those sources. And then in column number 3, the percentage of total revenue that's coming from that revenue source. So you may have a property tax is your number one revenue source, then property tax in column 1. In column 2, how much from the property tax? So it might be, $15.5 million a year from the property tax. And then column 3, what percentage of all of their revenue is coming from the property tax? So that's the table you'll prepare for question number 5. And again, even if you've never dealt with budgets before, this is going to be pretty readily apparent from the budget. And I'll tell you why. If you've never looked at a city budget, some cities do a really good job of making their budget very open and accessible to citizens. So what they will oftentimes do is they'll oftentimes prepare a budget summary. And that budget summary could be 10 or 20 or 30 pages. And in that budget summary, they'll oftentimes provide graphics for you. So they'll give you a pie chart of all the different sources of revenue. Or they may even give you a table that you'll then reproduce for question 5, showing all the different sources of revenue. So that information should be pretty readily available in a budget summary for your city's budget. Then question 6, you're going to do the same thing, except you're going to do it for expenditures. So again, you're going to create a table for me. First column, the top 3 areas of expenditure. And I'll give you a hint now. For most cities, the number one area of spending is public safety. And that's, for the vast majority of cities across the country, not just here in Southern California. But the top 3 things they spend their money on, how much is being spent on each one of those areas of expenditure, and then the percentage of total expenditures that's being spent on that object of expenditure. So same type of table, only for expenditures in question 6. And again, question 6 is something everyone should be able to answer. So I'm expecting answers to 5 and 6, irrespective of how much experience you have looking at public budgets. Question 7 asks you, is the city fiscally solvent? So based upon your review of the city's budget, do you consider the city to be fiscally solvent? Now, coming into the class, you may not have enough information in order to answer that question. So again, here saying I don't have the information to answer that question is fair game. Once you get to the post-instructional, though, you will have the information to assess the fiscal solvency of your city. Throughout the class, we'll talk about indicators of fiscal solvency, such as Brown's and Wang and Twos, and I'll give you a few different indicators that you can look at to determine whether or not your city is fiscally solvent. You don't have that information yet for the pre-instructional, so again, if you don't have that information, just say I don't have the information to answer that question. Question 8, what information did you use to arrive at that answer? Again, if you're not answering 7, then you're repeating I don't have the information for question 8. Some people will have that information. Some people will have the knowledge of the budget. They can take a stab at how fiscally solvent the city is. It all depends upon your experience that you're coming into the class with regarding public budgeting and finance. But you kind of get the idea of this pre-instructional assignment. You get a city's budget, you read it, and then you answer those 8 questions. The pre-instructional assignment is going to be graded on basically a credit, no credit type of basis. So it's going to be some very easy points that you will earn as long as you turn it in. Now, again, you may not have the answers to these questions. I'm not grading these questions based upon the quote unquote correctness of the answer. This is an honest self-assessment that you are taking to show me what you currently know about public budgeting and finance. And that's all this is being used for, is just an assessment type of device. And that's what we call your pre-instructional assignment. Any questions right now on the pre-instructional assignment? Let's see, I think we have a question in text chat. Allie, good question. Do we use the 21-22 adopted or 22-23 proposed budget? It's usually best to use the adopted budget. You can use either one, but if you have access to both, I would recommend using the adopted budget because that's what's already been adopted and it is already in place, as opposed to just being proposed. Because we all know those proposed budgets certainly can change as they go through the approval process. So it's a very good question. Okay, absolutely. As you work on the pre-instructional assignment, again, any questions emerge, feel free to post them in the questions form on our Beach Board site, or just shoot me an email directly, and I'm happy to answer any questions. But again, just look at this as a benign assessment type of device. So don't worry about right or wrong answers. We don't worry about right or wrong answers until we get to the post-instructional assignment. This should be a very short assignment. Now, again, especially if you don't have the information, you're just giving me, I don't have the information to answer the question. Don't be alarmed if it is very short, because there's not a whole lot that's going into it. Even if you are able to answer all 8 of the questions based upon your previous experience with budgeting, it still should not be a terribly long assignment. I think here I say it should be brief, no more than 5 pages. Probably would be more likely to be a couple of pages. So not a whole lot that goes into it. Just gives me a sense of where you currently are in your knowledge of budgeting as you enter the course. Where the answers then start to become more important, obviously, will be on the post-instructional assignment. So in this course, for the post-instructional assignment, we're using a 2-part assignment. The first part of the assignment, we are going to ask you to redo those 8 questions. So using the same city's budget you used for the pre-instructional, you will answer those 8 questions again, but this time you'll do it with all the available information you received in the course. So you can use information from Excel. You can use information from the recordings of our class sessions. You can use information from the slides. You can use information from outside sources if you would like. So you'll use all the information at your disposal to then re-answer those 8 questions for the same city that you use for your pre-instructional assignment. So for part 1 of the post-instructional assignment, it's no longer fair game to say I don't have the information, because you do have the information, because you've been given the information. So you will have to provide answers to those 8 questions in part 1 of the post-instructional assignment. But there is a part 2 to the post-instructional assignment as well. And if you remember, we talked about the course learning objectives. We'd say pretty much any public budgeting course that's worth its salt will require that you put a budget together as you leave the course. Well, that's what part 2 of this post-instructional assignment is. So then for part 2 of the post-instructional assignment, what you will do is you'll use an exercise that was first developed by Mark Huddleston several years ago in a textbook called the Public Administration Workbook. I was a reviewer for Mark on the textbook several years ago, reviewed several different editions of it. And one of the perks of being a reviewer is that you then have the ability to use it in your course. And so you kind of get waived from copyright regulations if you were a reviewer on the textbook. That's a perk of being a textbook reviewer. So I've been using this assignment for the past few years. I think it's a good, simple assignment, but it's an assignment that allows you the opportunity to put together a budget, a simple line item budget of your own. So in this assignment for part 2, in this exercise, what you will be doing is you'll be playing the role of a deputy budget director for a county. The county supervisors voted to take their library system and consolidate the library system. So in this county, you have a library system that consists of several different branch libraries. And each branch library had its own unique budget. Your direction as deputy budget director is to take all of these different branch library budgets and consolidate them together into one countywide consolidated library budget. So it sounds pretty simple, but it becomes a little bit more complicated once you start to get into some of the specifics of the assignment. So what I've provided for you, and we're going to go through these documents in a second. I'll share my screen and you can see what they look like. But I provided you with 2 different documents. I provided you with a PDF file called Huddleston, and that provides the parameters that you must operate within in putting together this consolidated library budget. And I've also provided you with an Excel spreadsheet that's entitled Line Item. Both of those documents are provided for you under the content area of our Beach Board site. They're also provided for you in the Dropbox as well. So they're there for you in a couple of different places for you to find. But let me show you both of those documents you're going to be using in doing this part 2 of your post-instructional assignment. So let me stop this share really quick. And we're going to be going back and forth between different documents. So let me first share out the Huddleston file with you. Okay, hopefully you can see this thing that says Form 56. This is the Huddleston file, and this Huddleston file will give you the parameters you must operate within in doing this assignment. So when you open up the Huddleston file, you'll see that there's some preliminary information in it. Just skip over those first few pages. They're not that important. Skip straight to this thing called Form 56. Form 56 is the memo that you have received from your manager, the budget director, Sarah Johnson. She has sent this to you as the deputy budget director, giving you instructions on how to consolidate all these different branch library budgets into one countywide consolidated budget. And you see, as the memo says, this is regarding the library budget. As you know, the supervisors voted last night to approve the consolidation plan for the county library system. I'd like for you to take charge of putting together a preliminary first-year budget for the board's review. Your budget should take the following points into consideration. So as you consolidate all these different branch library budgets into one countywide budget, you must do so according to these 6 different requirements. Requirement number 1. As you consolidate these budgets, all existing public libraries in the county, including the branches in the city of Waynesfield, are to remain open. So you may not close any branch libraries when you do your consolidation. So all libraries have to remain open. Number 2, the county's cost-sharing agreement with the municipalities assumes that there will be an overall savings of 3% from the aggregate of the existing library budgets. And so as you consolidate all these budgets together into one consolidated countywide budget, you have to cut 3% from the amount that is currently being spent. And I'll show you the spreadsheet in a second, but the first thing you want to do with that spreadsheet, add up how much is currently being spent by all the different branch libraries, subtract 3% from that, and that then becomes your budget target for your new consolidated countywide budget. So you have to subtract 3% from what's currently being spent. Number 3 requirement, no cuts are to be made in any full-time library employees. Cuts may be proposed in other categories. So you may not lay off full-time employees. You may not reduce full-time employees' hours. You can make no cuts whatsoever to full-time library employees. You can cut any other area you want to. So you could cut part-time hours. You could cut the budget for acquisitions, perhaps the budget for maintenance and supplies. Just make sure that the cuts you're making in other areas won't cause a library to shut down, because all the libraries have to remain in operation. But no cuts at all to any full-time employees. Point number 4, and this takes a little explaining, but this is probably the most difficult thing you're going to have to do. As per the county's agreement with the public employee unions, salary scales within job classifications are to be standardized at the highest levels currently paid by any of the newly consolidated units. What this means is that due to the collective bargaining agreement with public employee unions, all salaries within a position classification need to be the same. They need to be standardized. So all branch librarians will make the same salary regardless of what branch they are working in. All reference librarians will make the same salary regardless of where they are working. All assistant librarians will make the same salary. So you have to standardize the salaries in each position classification to the highest salary that is currently being paid by any of the units, any of the branch libraries. Now, a nice little shortcut here is the city of Waynesfield is by far the largest branch library. As the largest branch library, it has the highest salaries for just about every position across the board, with the exception of maybe one. Now, I'll let you find that one on your own. But you're typically going to be standardizing salaries up to, for the most part, what the city of Waynesfield is currently paying for someone in that position classification. So the problem you run into, and what makes this a little bit more difficult of an endeavor, is when you compare point number 2 to point number 4, point number 2 says you're going to have to save 3%. So you're going to have to be making some cuts somewhere. While at the same time in number 4, a lot of people are going to be getting raises. So people who work at smaller branches, they're going to get their salaries standardized to what's currently being paid at Waynesfield, which means they're going to get a pretty significant bump in their pay. So you can be spending more on salaries at the same time that you need to cut 3% from the overall budget. So that's what makes the cut a little bit heftier than just what it would originally look as a 3% off what you're originally spending. So you have to standardize all the salaries to the highest salary currently paid in each one of those position classifications. That standardization applies to full-time employee salaries. It also applies to the hourly wages of part-time employees as well. So everything gets standardized to the highest amount currently being paid. Point number 5, all township and village librarians previously designated head librarians, either full or part-time, will be redesignated branch librarians and will be compensated accordingly. So when you turn in your final spreadsheet here in part 2, you should have no designation of head librarian. There'll be no more head librarians. And so if I see your final spreadsheet and I see head librarian on it, that's an issue. There's no more designation head librarian. Those head librarians become branch librarians and then will be paid accordingly to what the highest amount currently being paid to branch librarians is. Now, I'll clue you into one potential issue here, is that you have some small branches that have part-time head librarians. So those part-time head librarians are going to become part-time branch librarians. There currently is not an existing salary for part-time branch librarian. So what I would recommend you do, just to keep it simple, is take what the full-time branch librarian is making, which is $34,000 a year, and cut it in half. So just pay your part-time branch librarians half of that, pay them $17,000 a year. I think that just makes the whole exercise a little bit easier for you. But all head librarians will become branch librarians, regardless of whether they're full-time or part-time. And then finally, the head librarian in the city of Waynesfield. That position, you'll see there's one head librarian in Waynesfield that's getting paid $40,000 a year. That position's going away and is being replaced with a new position called Director of County Libraries. And that director position will be compensated at $45,000. So that person who used to get paid $40,000 to be a head librarian in Waynesfield is now getting paid $45,000 to be a director of county libraries. So as you consolidate, then you have to do all your consolidation in accordance with those 6 different parameters. Yeah, please go ahead.
Sorry. Will there still be a branch librarian at the Waynesfield library?
Yes, there will still be branch librarians at the Waynesfield Library. So I believe there are I think there are 6 of them, maybe. I don't remember. We'll see on the spreadsheet when I pull it up. But yes, there are branch librarians in Waynesfield.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure. So your budget needs to adhere to these 6 different parameters. And so again, that's what makes this, it's not a terribly challenging endeavor, but it does make it a little bit more challenging than just, squishing all the budgets together into one consolidated budget. This Huddleston file, the main utility of this Huddleston file is just to remind you of these 6 different parameters. That's what you're going to use the file for. So you can disregard all the rest of the file. Just Form 56, these 6 parameters, that's what you're going to use the Huddleston file for. Just make sure you adhere to those 6 different requirements. And what you'll be using then is you'll then be using the spreadsheets. Let me share that with you. Okay, hopefully you're seeing an Excel spreadsheet now. This is a spreadsheet you're going to be using for part 2 of the post-instructional assignment. The nice thing about this spreadsheet is that it already has all the formulas in it. And what I've tried to do is, I know some people come in with some very advanced Excel skills. Some people come in without any Excel skills really at all. And so I want to kind of level the playing field so everyone can do this assignment regardless of what their experience with Excel is. So as you'll see in this spreadsheet, the formulas are already there. So when you change your numbers, the results will change. So as you'll see here, the way in which the spreadsheet works is that you have all your different branch libraries arrayed across the top. So your biggest library is the city of Waynesfield. Then column B, you have all the different positions in Waynesfield. So Waynesfield currently has a head librarian. The head librarian is making $40,000 a year. That head librarian goes away and gets replaced with a director of county libraries at $45,000 a year. There'll be one of those, and so already you've spent an extra $5,000 because you're now paying this person $45,000 a year. You'll see right now in Waynesfield, there are branch librarians. There are 6 of them. They each make $34,000 a year for a total of $204,000. You have 5 reference librarians, each making $32,000 a year for a total of $160,000. 9 assistant librarians making $29,000 a year for a total of $261,000. You get the idea. You then have part-time librarians as well. You have 2 part-time reference librarians, 3 part-time assistant librarians. Then in addition to the librarians, you then have other staff members. You have 1 administrative assistant. You have 8 circulation clerks. You have 2 secretaries. You have 4 maintenance workers. You have 3 pages. Then you also have other part-time employees. So you have 6 circulation clerks. Those I'm sorry, you have 7,020 hours that these circulation clerks are working at $6 an hour. Again, this is before minimum wage of $15 an hour. So they're only making $6 an hour, but they're working a grand total of 7,020 hours for a total of $42,120. Then you have maintenance workers getting paid $575 an hour, working a total of 2,000 hours, 11,500, and so on and so on. Then your other operating expenditures, acquisitions for the city of Waynesfield branch, $275,000 a year, $110,000 for supplies, $96,700 for utilities, $32,600 for maintenance, and $43,000 for other expenditures. The grand total that's currently being spent by the city of Waynesfield branch as by far the largest branch in the system, $1,743,345. Then you'll see you have other branches that are much smaller. So here's a really small one, Clear Creek. Clear Creek currently has 1 full-time head librarian. Now again, head librarians are going away. This person will become a full-time branch librarian. They're currently making $25,000 a year. They're going to get a raise to what the branch librarians are making in the city of Waynesfield. So this person immediately goes from $25,000 a year up to $34,000 a year. So they get a $9,000 raise. Not much else going on here in Clear Creek. There's maintenance workers working 780 hours, only $2,500 in acquisitions. Acquisitions basically getting the material for the library, books, media, things like that. $750 for supplies, $3,600 utilities, $1,260 maintenance. So you'll see for poor little Clear Creek, they're only spending $37,361 a year. So it's a much smaller branch. And the same thing then, as you go across your spreadsheet, you've got a branch in Wolford. You have a branch in East Wolford. Let me scoot it over here. You have a branch in Glen Ridge, one in Littleton, one in Keeler, one in Mount Tom, one in Warren, one in Lansdale, one in New Bremen. So those are all your branch libraries. So your job is to take all these individual branch library budgets, consolidate them into one county-wide budget, adhering to those 6 requirements that we talked about in the Huddleston PDF file. Your first thing you're going to do, obviously, is you're going to add up how much is being spent. So you go down to row 33, you add up how much all the branches are spending all together, you auto sum that. That then gives you the total amount currently being spent. Subtract 3% from that, and your new consolidated budget may not spend more than that new target figure of 3% less than what is currently being spent by all the unconsolidated branches. So that's your first place to start, because that thing gives you your budget target, and then you can go through and start making your changes and making your cuts. Any questions so far?
They'll still be represented as each individual budgets. It's just making the changes that you talked about in that other document, right?
What I would recommend do is to provide, the format it's in now with the changes, but then also give me another sheet where you consolidate it down into just 4 columns. So the first column will be all of your positions and objects of expenditure, then the amount being spent on each unit, the number of units of those expenditures, and then the total for the entire countywide budget. So you can, got it. So just 2 different sheets, one sheet like this, and then one sheet with just those 4 columns.
This one's the working budget.
Exactly. Yep. We don't really need to get, sure. Yeah, the question about the data on how many visitors per branch per year, that's not part of the exercise, so we don't really have that information provided. You can make reasonable assumptions if you would like. You just have to make sure that you keep all the branches open. So, even if you got a branch like Clear Creek, which probably doesn't have a whole lot of visitors every year, it's still got to stay open, even though there's not a whole lot going on in that branch. So all the branches have got to stay open in this consolidated budget. So for part 2, you're turning in the spreadsheet, this consolidated budget, and then you're also going to give me a justification of the cuts you made, because obviously you're going to have to be making cuts to get down to your budget target amount. So give me a justification for, you may say, well, I cut X amount of money from acquisitions. Well, justify why that's not going to close down a branch, how the branch is going to continue to get the materials they need with this cut. And so give me a justification for why you made the cuts that you made. If you're going to eliminate some part-time positions, a good justification would be eliminating these part-time positions will not jeopardize the branch. The branch will remain open. So you've got a lot of part-time positions in Waynesfield. So you might be able to argue cutting some of those positions to save some money, and you've got other people to backfill those positions. But I need some justifications for why you made the cuts that you made. Now, there are a couple of ways you can go about that depending upon how familiar and comfortable you are with Excel. If you're familiar and comfortable with Excel, you can go ahead and just put your justifications as comments. You can just use the comment feature and just put your comments in each cell, and I can read your justifications directly in the spreadsheet. If you're not that comfortable with Excel, you can always give me a separate Word file where you just list out all your justifications for your cuts. Either way is acceptable, depending upon how comfortable and familiar you are with Excel. A lot of people like to just put them directly into the spreadsheet with the comment function. Some people give me a separate narrative. I leave that completely up to you. If you are very unfamiliar with Excel, I would recommend that Dr. Moore spent the past semester putting together basically a workshop, a tutorial on Excel. And in our Beachboard site for this class, if you go under the content section of the site, you'll see there's a link there for Excel tutorial. That will then take you to a series of videos that Dr. Moore put together to guide you through how to use Excel and how to do different types of functions in Excel. You're not going to need all those things to do this assignment, but it's good to take a look at that and keep that link, because you may then need it down the road when you're doing your 555 case study when you get to PPA 697. So it's a good thing to have and a good thing to be able to refer to. So if you don't know a lot about Excel, go and take a look at the Excel tutorial. Again, it's a series of, I think, 5 or 6 videos that Dr. Moore put together that I think will be very helpful to get you kind of up to speed on how to use Excel for budget creation and analysis. And also, as I said, all the formulas are in here. So if you're going to reduce a position, then you can just change the number in the end column, and now automatically change the total amount you're spending, because all the formulas are already in there. Okay. So just to reiterate, for part 2, well, we'll just say for the post-instructional assignment, there are 2 parts. The first part, you'll re-answer those 8 questions from the pre-instructional assignment for your city's budget. And then the second part, you'll be putting together this consolidated countywide library spreadsheet along with your justifications for the cuts that you decided to make. And that's going to be your post-instructional assignment. Okay. Now, again, this is something you'll be looking at over the next few weeks. I know, digesting over the next few weeks. And so as you're working on it, questions emerge. Again, feel free to post in the questions forum. Feel free to send me an email, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have as you work through the post-instructional assignment. So let's now head back to our syllabus. I just thought it was good to go through that kind of, I know it takes a while and kind of detailed, but just so you kind of have an idea of what you're doing on that post-instructional now on the first night of class, so that you can start thinking about it and start working on it as we go through our next 6 weeks together. So let's go back where we left off here in the syllabus. Eventually, we'll get there. Let me just move my camera a little bit and do it this way. Okay. So we were at evaluative criteria. So you know what the pre-instructional assignment is. You know what the 2-part post-instructional assignment is as well. Then there's also a final examination. And I hate the word examination. I still call it an exam. It's really much more of an assessment, in that it's not your traditional examination. We're a graduate level program, and I know some instructors use exams and use timed exams. I don't, because I don't really think they're all that applicable to what we're trying to accomplish, and certainly not applicable to what you're doing on a daily basis in the public sector. You're very rarely going to have to sit down and answer questions in 5 or 10 minutes. So what it really is the final assessment. It's going to consist of 5 different scenarios. And I'll provide you with 5 scenarios that I write that are kind of, they reflect what's going on in the real world of public budgeting, the quote unquote real world of public budgeting. And what you'll need to do is you'll need to apply course information appropriately to those scenarios. So there aren't right or wrong answers to the scenarios on the final assessment. What you're doing is you're justifying your answers. So there could be a multitude of different ways that you answer one of the scenarios, as long as you justify it. And as long as you can convince me that, yes, this is an appropriate way to address this scenario, then you'll get full credit for that scenario. It is not a timed exam, and so you'll have 2 weeks to work on the final assessment. I will make it available on our Beach Board site 2 weeks before the end of the course. I may even make it available I'll probably make it available 3 weeks before the end of the course, give you an extra week. And you'll have all that time then to work on the final assessment. You can use all the information from the class, Micel, our PowerPoint slides, our recordings, all that information you can use to answer the scenarios on the final. Because again, it's all about your ability to apply the information, which I think is a lot more practical for what we tend to do on a daily basis in the public sector. And then finally, you'll have these 5 graded Beach Board postings. Now, the first one is an introduction. I know a lot of people have already done that one. That's ungraded. I'm just asking you to go into the introduction form if you haven't done so already, and just share a little bit about you, who you are, what you do, why you're in the class, just so we can kind of get to know each other a little bit. And then beginning with Beach Board number 1 through number 5, all those are then graded Beach Board postings. I will give you a prompt. You'll then go in there and you'll respond to that prompt. And I'll show you those once we get through with the syllabus in just a second. So again, I think that the assignments are pretty reasonable. I didn't want to, again, overwhelm you with assignments in 6 weeks. There's only so much time in a day, and I know most of you have full-time jobs and family obligations and all those good things going on in addition to being in graduate school. So I want to keep the assignments to a minimum and just make sure all the assignments are applicable to what we're trying to accomplish and will be useful and helpful for you. So those are your assignments that you'll be doing throughout the next 6 weeks. We already did all of this. I've got just a real quick rubric there for the beach board postings. The rule of thumb with the beach board postings is parsimony. Try to be as concise as you can possibly be. 2 or 3 paragraphs usually is enough to get the job done with the beach board postings. I've already mentioned the final exam, which is a series of 5 different scenarios. We've already talked about that, and so a little bit of a grading rubric for that one. So what will we be talking about and when will we cover the information? Well, tonight obviously is our first Zoom session here on the 23rd. We're reviewing the syllabus, we're reviewing the course requirements, we're going to talk about introduction to public finance and budgeting, and if time permits, a little bit on the history and process of budgeting as well. And that's what we'll be doing this week. Next week, there's no class next Monday. I got that's the wrong date. There's no class Monday because of Memorial Day, so we will not have a Zoom session next Monday. But what we're going to cover next week, we'll then push that to week number 3. So budgeting formats will get pushed then to week number 3. You'll see in the red is where I have all the due dates for the assignments. So I'm asking you to post your introduction by May 29th. Then beach board essay number 1, posted by June the 5th. And I'll show you that in just a second. Then in week 3, like I said, we'll do budget formats. We'll do analysis and accounting in budgeting. Then by June 12th, your pre-instructional assignment is due. And then your beach board essay number 2 is also due on June 12th. Then in week 4, we'll get into public expenditures, estimating revenues, capital budgeting, and debt management. Beach board essay number 3 is due then by June 19th. Then week 5 on June 20th, we will talk about taxation, how you evaluate different forms of taxation, property, income, sales, non-tax revenue. You've got beach board essay number 4, which is due by the 26th, and then your 2-part post-instructional assignment will be due on June 26th as well. Then our final week together, our final Monday session on June 27th, collecting of revenue, and then intergovernmental fiscal relations and course wrap-up. Then you have your final beach board essay number 5 due by the last day of class, which is July 1st. And your final examination then will also be due on that last day of class on July 1st as well. So it's 6 weeks. Things do roll around very, very quickly. Material is accelerated in a 6-week class. So you really want to get on top and stay on top of all those assignments. I've reiterated all the due dates there for you for all the assignments, just for your kind of one-stop shopping so you know exactly when everything is due. I usually don't accept late assignments unless prior arrangements have been made. I do understand that life tends to intervene at times, even in a 6-week course. If life is intervening for you and it's going to mean you can't get an assignment turned in on a due date, please reach out to me in advance and let me know that, and we can always make provisions. If provisions are not made, then there's a 10% late penalty per 24-hour period that an assignment is late. Everything, obviously, since we are an online class, is delivered virtually. And so I have drop boxes set up for the pre-instructional, post-instructional assignment, and the final examination. And then your 5 beach board postings will all be posted directly in the relevant beach board forum. All the rest of these are disclaimers here. You can read through those on your own. Again, I don't take attendance. I don't do that because I believe we're a graduate program. I leave it completely up to you. I also know some of you at times will have some conflicts on a Monday evening with maybe city council meetings or something like that, depending upon your job. Everything is recorded. The recording will be made available on our beach board site by the following day that you can go back and watch. And I'll let you read through all the required syllabus elements on your own. So that, in a very large 1-hour nutshell, is the syllabus and the course requirements. So any basic preliminary questions on the syllabus or course requirements as of right now? Okay. If not, then let me start up a new share. And It is gone. Okay, let me share my screen then. This will be easier. And let me go on into our Beachboard site. Okay, hopefully everyone can see the Beachboard site. I hope I'm still logged in. Sometimes it logs me out. But if you haven't looked at the Beachboard site yet, this is it. A lot of your important information will be under the content section of the site. So when you go under content, you'll see that, again, the Zoom link, you all know where that's at because you're here. So syllabus, if you need a refresher on the syllabus. Each week I've put our PowerPoint slides we're going to be using up in those weeks. I've also added some additional information that may be helpful, some links and some things, examples and things such as that. So, here week 2, we're really going to be talking about this in week 3, but budget formats, I'll give you some examples of different budget formats. We'll go through all of that in 2 weeks when you talk about budget formats. In week number 3, when you talk about analysis and accounting, I give you some examples of things like unaudited actuals, examples of what a public audit looks like, performance-based and management-based audit, performance-based and fiscal audit look like. I give you an example of what a comprehensive annual financial report looks like as well. So just try to give you some of that information that could be helpful supplemental information for you in each one of those weeks. So you can get the PowerPoint slides, you can get all that supplemental information in each relevant week. You'll see then for the pre and post instructional assignments, they've been posted here for you as well. So pre instructional, post instructional, the Huddleston file, which you'll be using for Form 56, those 6 parameters, and then the line item spreadsheet you'll be using. Final exam is hidden right now. I'll make that available in a couple of weeks, and you'll have 3 weeks to work on that. And then for our recordings, I will put our recordings here in summer 2022. So whenever you want to look at your recording for a given week, it will be there. And then here's the Excel tutorial. This is what's very useful if you haven't used Excel before. It is a link to OneDrive, which will then provide you with links to each one of those videos. And so if you haven't used Excel, I strongly recommend you go and take some time and look through those videos to kind of acquaint yourself with how Excel works. Dropboxes right here. And so I've got our Dropboxes set up for the pre-instructional, post-instructional, and the final exam. For your weekly discussion board posts, those will all occur here. Again, I have a questions form for any general questions that you may have course related. You can post there or email me directly. If you haven't posted your introduction yet, please do that by May 29th. Your first graded Beachboard posting is this one, Beachboard number 1. Please review the governor's budget proposal and the May revise at the following link. Just click on that link. You'll see this year's proposed budget from the governor. You'll see this year's May revision, and then you'll see the parameters for the adopted budget for this year. What I want you to do is take a look at the governor's proposed budget, take a look at the May revise, identify 2 priorities that you see in the governor's proposed budget, and then talk a bit about how those priorities change as a result of the May revision. And then that will be your original post. Again, 2-3 paragraphs is usually enough to suffice there, and then respond to at least one of your classmates. Beachboard number 2, please consider the budget that you're using for your pre-instructional assignment. Discuss what budget format is used by the city. And then if you had to recommend a different budget format, what format would you recommend and why? And again, respond to one classmate. Beachboard number 3, for the city that you use in your pre-instructional assignment, obtain a copy of the annual financial report. Again, they're now not called CAFRs, they're called ACFRs, but get a copy of the annual financial report. If you cannot obtain the CAFR for your city, please use one from another city. You should be able to get it. It should be available on the website along with the budget. And hopefully you can use the same city for your budget and for your annual financial report. Read through the annual financial report, and according to the information you reviewed in the annual financial report, how fiscally solvent is your city? What information did you use to arrive at this conclusion? And did your fiscal solvency conclusion differ between your review of the budget and your review of the annual financial report? Respond to one classmate. The number 4, compare the different types of long-term debt cities utilize to fund their capital projects, identify different types of bonds and discuss their advantages and disadvantages, and respond to a classmate. And then your final, 5th and final beach board posting, please consider the city you chose for your pre-instructional assignment. How progressive is the tax structure in your city? Recommend different types of taxes or different distribution of tax revenue for your city. Why did you make this recommendation? And as always, respond to at least one classmate. So those are your graded beach board essays. Again, as I said before, 2 to 3 paragraphs is usually sufficient as a response to my initial prompt. And then 1 paragraph response to a classmate is certainly enough to get the job done. And that is our beach board 555 site. So just wanted to take you on a little quick tour of that so you know what resources are available for you and what's on the site and how you're going to be using the site throughout our next 6 weeks. So that's the course. Any questions about the beach board site? Any questions about the syllabus or the course requirements? If not, I usually like to do a break every class session. I think that's important that we don't just, plow through 2.5 hours. And so this is probably a really good time to take a break. So it's about 7:11. Let's take let's take a break until 7:25. Come back at 7:25, and then we'll get into a discussion of the introduction to public finance. We'll talk about market failures, externalities, and all the reasons why we have public expenditures and why we have the public budgets that we currently have today. So take a break till 7:25, come back, and we'll do our intro to public budgeting and finance. Okay, we are back. Let's get our recording going again. It's running. Okay. What I'd like to do in the second half of the class is to, again, get us started on some of our substantive information and talk about public finance and budgeting, kind of talk about what public budgets are, talk about why we have public budgets, public versus private expenditures, some of the reasons why the public sector intervenes and gets involved in providing and or producing these types of expenditures. Talk a bit about some of the decisions that we tend to make in public budgeting, and then if time allows us, I don't know if it will, but we'll see how we're doing in time. And if we do have time, then we'll then shift into a discussion of the budgeting process at the 3 levels of government and talk about the 4 main cycles or phases in public budgeting. So let's start with a basic definition of budgeting. I think we all have a pretty good idea of what a budget is, whether it's a budget for a government, whether it's a budget for a nonprofit organization, whether it's our private budget for balancing our checkbook or whatever the case may be. When we think about budgets, we really think about budgets as kind of dollars and cents. And so in a budget, we're going to say this is the amount of money we are spending, and this is what we are spending that money on. In the Constitution, that's what's known as appropriation. The Constitution has an appropriations clause that says Congress must first say how the money is being spent, what the money is being spent on, before that money can be taken from the Treasury. That's appropriation. And that's basically what we do with budgets. We say this is how much we're spending, this is what we're spending that money on. What I think we should look at more in this class is a definition of a budget as a true statement of societal priorities. It's a statement of priorities in terms of how much we as a society are willing to spend, who's doing the spending, who are the beneficiaries of that spending, and what's that money being spent on. In the world of public budgeting, we obviously have infinite demands and we have finite resources. There will always be infinite demands placed upon governments to do more and to hopefully do more with less. But we always have finite, limited resources to respond to those infinite demands. When infinite demands come into conflict with finite resources, by definition, it means there are choices and decisions to be made. We need to prioritize. And so throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, we prioritize pandemic-oriented spending. And so a lot of governments got one-time monies to help them with the pandemic. We spent a lot of money on testing. We spent a lot of money on, supporting vaccine development and vaccine rollouts. We really prioritized combating the COVID-19 pandemic. At other points in time, we have really emphasized defense spending. And we've spent a lot of money on defense, especially if you have, international wars going on, you have to provide support to NATO allies, you may prioritize defense. Sometimes we prioritize education, sometimes we prioritize health and human services, but a budget really is a statement of societal priorities. That's really important because once you view a budget as a statement of societal priorities, what you're doing is you're taking that budget and you are elevating it. You're making it about so much more than just dollars and cents. It really is a microcosm of what we value and what we believe in as a society, which makes that budget, again, a very, very substantial and very important type of document. Well, you're taking a public budgeting and finance course in an MPA program. You can also take budgeting courses in the College of Business. You can take budgeting courses in all kinds of different types of programs. So why the focus on public budgeting here as opposed to private budgeting? Well, one reason why we have public budgets is because we have the perceived need for public expenditures. We have this perceived need that it's up to government, it's up to the public sector to provide and or produce this good or service that is deemed necessary by society. As I'm sure you know from your undergraduate economics courses, one reason why we have public intervention in the provision and or production of goods and services is because of the existence of this thing called a market failure. The market fails to produce it. Market failures should not really be viewed as a pejorative term. It's not anything negative against the private sector. It's just markets tend to fail to produce needed goods and services when either the market chooses not to produce them or when the market simply because of logistical barriers cannot produce those goods and those services. Obviously, they'll choose not to produce those goods and services if there's no bottom line. So if there's no profit incentive, there's really no incentive for the private sector to put their resources and time into providing and producing a good or service. If it's deemed as a necessary good or service, then that vacuum then gets filled by government. And that's when we have public expenditures. Obviously, the more public expenditures we have, the bigger our public budgets will become. We also, there are some situations when the private sector, because of logistical types of limitations, simply cannot produce and provide a good or a service. And we have a lot of private sector package delivery. And so we have UPS and FedEx, and now we have Amazon and Amazon Prime, and all these delivery companies that will deliver packages. Everyday mail service, though, still tends to be a monopoly of the United States Postal Service. Well, one reason is constitutional, because one of the powers of Congress is to establish post offices in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. But another reason is just logistics. In order to get involved in everyday mail delivery, it would probably be cost prohibitive for a private sector corporation to take on that type of a burden. So because of that type of natural monopoly, you're going to have public intervention, you're going to have public expenditures. We also know we have public intervention and public expenditures because of the presence of what we call externalities. Again, something I'm sure you learned about in your micro course. An externality is a spillover effect. And so we're trying to produce a good. In producing that good, we have all these unintended consequences. And externalities can be either positive or they can be negative in nature. The most common type of spillover externality is a negative externality. So as our friends in the world of economics will tell us, we have a widget factory. And that widget factory is up on a hill. And that widget factory is doing its level best to produce the best quality widgets for all of society to enjoy. But in producing those widgets, they inadvertently pollute the river that runs behind the factory. That's a spillover. They didn't intend to do it. It's an unintended consequence, and it's a very negative unintended consequence. The presence of those negative externalities like pollution suggests for us a role for government. So government will probably get involved to regulate how those widgets are being made and to regulate the amount of pollution that's being dispensed into that river that runs behind the widget factory. They may impose cost burdens to the corporation. So the corporation will recognize the cost that the pollution means for society in general. So there's a role for government to get involved when you have those negative types of externalities. Some externalities are positive in that they're beneficial to society. So you think about something like a childhood immunization program for income eligible families. The primary beneficiaries of that childhood immunization program will be the families themselves, the children, the families that are actually qualifying for that immunization program. They're the primary direct beneficiaries. But in theory, the rest of the community will also benefit from lower levels of disease. That's a positive benefit. Now, those other members of society are not directly engaging in the immunization program, but they are getting a positive benefit from it. The problem is goods that create a positive externality tend to be underproduced, whereas goods that produce a negative externality tend to be overproduced. So why is that? Well, clearly, if you've got these positive externalities and you have people in society who are benefiting from the creation of this good or service, but they're not directly paying for it, then their demand is not going to be factored in to the supply decisions being made by a corporation. Corporations going to make their decisions about how much supply to create based upon the purchasing. And so if people are buying more, then they'll create more supply to meet that demand. But the demand from people who aren't directly purchasing those goods is not going to go into the decision-making calculus of those corporations. So they're probably going to underproduce those goods that are resulting in a positive externality. They're going to overproduce goods that result in a negative externality unless they are held accountable for those costs that are associated with that negative externality. So there's a role for government to play in government intervention, both with goods that create positive as well as negative externalities. With goods that produce positive externalities, the role could be a subsidization role, where government will get involved in subsidizing the production of that good or service so there are more goods being produced. In terms of negative externalities, they might get involved in regulating the production to decrease the production to try and decrease the amount of those negative externalities. So market failures and externalities explain a good portion of why government gets involved in the provision and or the production of these goods and these services. Why is it important to us tonight? Because obviously the more government gets involved, the larger public budgets become, and the more there is for us to study in public budgeting. Oops. So how does budgeting then fundamentally differ from private sector budgeting? In your time in the program, you may have had the chance to read a great article by Graham Allison. And in Graham Allison's article, it's I always get the title wrong, but it's Public and Private Sectors, Are They Fundamentally Alike in All Unimportant Respects? Basically, what Allison argues in his article is that public and private management have some strong similarities in that all managers engage in things such as staffing. They have to hire employees. They have to budget. They have to bring revenue into their organization and spend money. They all have to, deal with external environments. They all have to engage in strategic planning. These are things that all managers do. But Allison makes the argument it's not what they're doing, but rather it's how they're doing it. So how public managers manage their human resources will be different than the way in which private sector managers do it. Not to digress too much, but private sector managers deal with at-will employees. So these employees can be fired for, a multitude of reasons. Public sector managers deal with civil servants who are usually unionized. And so they're very limited in how they can manage their human resources. In terms of finance and budgeting, in the private sector, a lot of that money is coming from profits. In the public sector, that money is coming from appropriations. If you're getting your money in the private sector from profits, that money is going to be a lot more unstable. And it's going to be based directly on how good of a product you are creating and how well you're marketing that product. In the public sector, appropriations tend to be much more stable. And so you don't have the same volatility in terms of your resources you have in the public sector than you might have over in the private sector. So I think what Allison tells us is it's really the how that's different between the two sectors. I think that's true for public budgeting as well. You have a variety of actors in public as well as private budgeting. The difference is you have a much larger variety of actors in public budgeting than you may have in private sector budgeting. John Gauss, another very well-known public administration theorist, is best known for his theory known as the ecology of public administration. And Gauss argues to us, if you want to understand what is happening in the public sector and in public organizations, we need to understand the ecology, the environment that surrounds those organizations. The environment that surrounds public organizations is much different than what surrounds private organizations. Private organizations tend to be highly accountable to their shareholders. Public sector organizations are highly accountable to citizens. They're highly accountable to elected officials. They are accountable to client groups. They are accountable to regulatory agencies, and so on and so on. There's a much larger variety of actors in the public environment as compared to the private environment. The type of money that we are dealing with is also different between the two sectors. In public budgeting, obviously, we're dealing with citizen money. We're dealing with taxpayer money. That dealing with taxpayer money means that there are heightened accountability standards that we have to adhere to in public organizations. So I served on an elected member of a school board for 6 years up until 2020. I was president of the board and clerk of the board. I was president of a joint financing authority. Whenever we deal with public money, we have to do it in public. We have the Brown Act that governs how our meetings are held. We have to allow public comment. We have to hold public hearings. So anytime that we were going to spend money, we had to do it in an open meeting. If we were spending money on certain types of things, we would have to hold a public hearing and allow public comments, both written as well as verbal comments. That's all done out in the open because, again, we're dealing with taxpayer money. Another example is in the public sector. In my school district, we passed a $148 million bond measure to modernize and do reconstruction at our schools. That $148 million bond measure is what's called a Prop 39 measure, which means that we only had to get 55% voter approval to approve that bond, but we also had to establish a citizen oversight committee. And the citizen oversight committee would then do audits and would review every single penny that was being spent to make sure it was being spent appropriately and in accordance with the ballot language that the voters approved when they approved that bond. Some more examples of accountability. Public records requests. Here in California, we have a Public Records Act, which allows the citizens to ask for public records. And you have to make those public records available. Again, a lot of accountability and scrutiny. Expenditures in the public sector are often planned very well in advance. Look no further than a capital budget. And once we get to a future session, we'll talk about the difference between operating and capital budgets. But capital budgeting is predicated upon usually at least a 5-year capital improvement plan. So you'll plan out all your capital improvement projects over at least a 5-year period of time, planning very, very well in advance. We have a lot more limitations and constraints, obviously, in public budgeting. You've all heard as public administration majors before, the old adage of serving many masters. In the public sector, we serve many masters. We serve the executive branch. We serve legislative branch. We serve the judicial branch. Again, we have interest groups that are very much involved. So we have a lot more constraints, a lot more limitations that are placed upon us in the public sector than are placed upon private sector counterparts. We have audit requirements in the public sector. We usually have to not only conduct legal financial audits, we also have to conduct performance and management-based audits as well. And there's a lot more scrutiny. Just again, speaking from a local school district level, our local school district budget had to be approved by the County Office of Education, which was then held accountable to the State Department of Education. If we wanted to change our election dates, we had to go through the County Committee on School District Reorganization, and then the County Department of Education, and then we had to go through the county clerk's office, then we had to go through the State Department of Education, and so on and so on. A lot more accountability, a lot more scrutiny in the public sector than in the private sector. Also, the types of goods that we fund in the public sector oftentimes differ from the types of goods funded by private sector organizations. And in your microeconomics class, you were probably introduced to the idea of different types of goods, public goods versus private goods, and the differences between those types of goods. In this class, we look at 4 different types of goods. At the opposite ends of the spectrum, at the extremes, you have what we consider to be pure public goods, and the other opposite end of the extreme, you have what are considered to be pure private goods. The primary difference between public and private goods deals with the concepts of exhaustion and exclusion. Can you use up the good? Can you exhaust the good? And can you exclude people from getting a benefit of the good if they don't pay the cost of that good? So can it be used up, and can you exclude people? If a good is both exhaustible as well as excludable, it's considered to be a pure private good. So something like a candy bar that you go into a convenience store to buy is considered a pure private good. It is exhaustible in that you and I are rivals for that candy bar. You and I go into that that convenience store at the same time. There's one candy bar left on the shelf. You're younger and more spry than I am, so you get to the candy bar first. You eat the candy bar, it's gone. You've consumed it. It's a rivalrous type of relationship. It can be used up. The candy bar is also excludable in that if the candy bar costs $1 and I don't have $1, I'm not going to be able to purchase and get a benefit from consuming that candy bar. That's why we leave candy bars with some regulation for consumer safety, but we leave candy bar production to the private sector. By contrast, pure public goods are non-exhaustible and non-excludable. So the classic quintessential example of that would be something like national defense. Now, granted, we do a lot of contracting in defense, where we contract with private sector corporations to provide the implements we will use in national defense. But national defense itself is considered a pure public good. My benefit that I get from national defense does not diminish the benefit that you will get from national defense. I may have this irrational fear that we're going to get invaded by British Columbia. And so I get a great benefit from knowing that national defense is there. You may not share that same irrational fear, but my benefit I get isn't using up your benefit that you're getting from national defense. And obviously, it's also non-excludable in that you can't say, well, this person gets national defense and this person does not get national defense. So those are your extremes. Pure private goods tend to be left to the private sector. Pure public goods tend to be left to the public sector. Where we have debates is in that gray area in between those two polar opposites. And there are 2 other types of goods in that gray area. There are what we call toll goods, and there are what we call common pool goods. In a toll good is something that cannot be exhausted, but it is excludable. So the obvious clear example is a toll road. You pull up to the toll road, the bar is down, you put your money in, the bar goes up, you drive on the road. You don't have the money to pay the toll, the bar doesn't go up, you don't get to drive on the road. So you can exclude people who do not pay. But it's really hard to exhaust it, though, that everyone who pays gets to drive on that road. You may have to wait till the person in front of you gets out of your way, but all the cars can drive on the road if they've paid the toll. A common pool good is the opposite of a toll good. So in a common pool good, it can be exhausted, but it's difficult, especially from a moral and ethical perspective, to exclude people. There are far fewer examples of common pool goods than your other three types of goods. But one example could be like mineral rights and rights to natural resources. Those natural resources can be exhausted. They can be used up, but it's difficult to exclude people from partaking in those benefits. So it's really the total goods and the common pool goods. It's that gray area in between where we argue about the proper role of the private and the public sector. This is where we get into our debates about privatization. Can this or should this good be privatized? Should it be turned over from the public to the private sector? So the more goods that we categorize as public goods, the larger our public budgets become. The more goods we categorize as private goods, the smaller our public budgets become, and the larger the scope of operations for the private sector. So as you know, over the years, we have tried to privatize. We've tried to take some goods that are normally produced and provided by the public sector, and we've tried to shift those production responsibilities over to the private sector. We've done that with, for example, prisons. We've done a lot of prison privatization. We've done education privatization. We've privatized things that are simple to privatize as trash collection. The moral of the story of privatization is that we have essentially privatized everything that is easy to privatize. So the closer something is to being a private good, the more you can exclude and the more it can be exhausted, the more we have privatized it because it's easier to privatize. The closer it is to the public side of the dimension, the much more difficult it is to privatize those goods and those services. Clearly, privatization, what we oftentimes refer to as load shedding, contracting out, reduces the amount of work that government is doing and turns it over to the private sector with the hope that you have more competition. More competition will then drive prices down, will make things more affordable for consumers, and hopefully will build in some incentives for efficiency that you may not have in the public sector. The disadvantage of privatization, obviously, is that you lose some control. So when the government, when public sector turns these production and provision responsibilities over to the private sector, they're turning over control to the private sector as well. And so they don't have the same quality control. They don't have the same control over rationing that they otherwise would have if it remained within the domain of government and the public sector. Now, this introduces to us this whole idea of provision and production. And you probably noticed up to this point, after the break, I've been talking a lot about provision and or production. And I've taken great pains to separate the terms provision and production. And there is a logical reason for that, in that they're not the same thing. Provision speaks to giving the resources that will make production possible. Production is the actual creation of that output, the actual creation of that good or that service. In order to produce that good or that service, you have to be provided the resources that will pay for that production process. So you think about like what we're doing here tonight. What we're doing here tonight is the production of education. The provision, the resources are, the fees that were paid to be in this class, the contributions we get since this is a summer class from the College of Professional and International Education. That's the provision of resources that then makes the production of what's going on tonight possible. If it's a pure public good left to the public sector, government does both. Government both provides, and government also produces. If it's a pure private good, you leave provision and production to the private sector. There are some cases in the middle ground, in the gray area, where government provides and the private sector produces. That's your classic example of contracting out. So the resources that pay for the contract for the private prison will come from government money, from taxpayer money. The actual running of the prison will be then left to the private prison company. So government provision, private sector production. You can also invert that, and you can have private sector provision and government production. Now that's a more unusual example, but one example that could be if you have a private concert promoter, and that concert promoter wants to have security at that concert venue. So the concert promoter will then pay the local police department to come and actually produce the security, actually be on hand to do the security. The money's coming from the private concert promoter. The actual creation of the output, the service, is being done by the public sector. But again, those examples are much more rare than the other three examples. But it's an important distinction, because sometimes we talk about privatization kind of in a monolithic type of terminology. It's not a monolith. There are different ways in which you can privatize. There are gradations to the privatization of provision and production within this whole privatization type of discussion. But anytime you privatize, why it's important for us is it then limits the scope of public expenditures and limits the size and the scope of our public budgets. But again, the old adage is that we've basically privatized just about everything that's easy to privatize. And the more difficult things to privatize, like education and prisons and all of those types of things, that's where we've struggled over the past few decades to kind of find the right balance between provision and production. But a public budget itself is what we consider to be a macro level document. It is a societal level document. How do we then get from the micro level to the macro level? How can we translate private individual decisions into macro level public decisions in a public document like a budget? But one thing we know is that public budgets are not summative. They are just not the summation of everyone's individual preferences. We can't just take everyone's individual preferences and add them up and call that our public budget. We have to prioritize in the budget, which means there are going to be some winners and there are going to be some losers. There are going to be some people who get what they want in the budget. There are going to be other people who do not get what they want in the public budget. So it is not a summative process. So we need to have some economic models that can help us determine how we put budgets together and what issues get included in budgets, what issues do not get included in budgets. So let me give you a couple of economic models. One of them you've heard of before, probably the other one you may not have, that helps explain how we get from the micro to the macro. One that you've probably heard of is what's called a Pareto optimal model. In the Pareto optimal model, a decision is worth pursuing, and for our purposes, a decision is worth putting into a public budget if it benefits at least one person without harming anyone else. So a Pareto optimal decision is one that benefits at least one person without harming anyone else in the process. Well, that sounds great in the classroom, but how often does that happen in the real world of public budgeting? Very seldom. If you've taken the policy class, PPA 670, you're aware of different types of policies. And we have three main types of policies in this country. There are distributive policies, redistributive policies, and regulatory policies. By far, the vast majority of our policies tend to be redistributive and regulatory in nature. A redistributive policy redistributes wealth and resources from one segment of society to another segment of society. Any welfare program, any social service program is going to be redistributive in nature. Believe it or not, Social Security is a redistributive program itself, in that those who are receiving Social Security benefits today, those benefits are being paid in by people who are currently in the workforce today. And then for those people who are currently in the workforce today, hopefully if Social Security is still around when they retire, their benefits are going to be paid for by people who are in the workforce at that point in time. So the vast majority are redistributive policies and programs. Anything that is redistributive, at least in face value, will violate the Pareto optimal principle, because some people are harmed, at least initially, with this policy choice. So Pareto optimal is not all that useful for us in explaining how we create public budgets. So there's an alternative economic model to Pareto called the Kaldor-Hicks model. And the Kaldor-Hicks model does a much better job of explaining the decisions that we make in our public budgets. The Kaldor-Hicks model takes the Pareto optimal model and kind of changes it up. It tweaks it a little bit. So the Kaldor-Hicks model says a policy is worth pursuing and worth funding in a budget if that policy benefits at least one person, but those who are harmed are compensated by those who benefit. So it allows for people to be harmed by this policy as long as those who are harmed gain some benefit down the road. So you think about how this allows a redistributive policy. A lot of our tax policies tend to be redistributive in nature. So you think about something like supply side economics and trickle down economics in the Reagan years. The idea behind trickle down economics is that you'll have targeted tax cuts for upper income individuals. Those targeted tax cuts will then provide more income for those individuals to use to create jobs. They will then create jobs in their businesses. Then people at the lower level of the economic strata will then be able to have employment, will be able to make more money because they're getting these jobs that are being created. The benefits trickle down the economic strata. That's an example of a Kaldor-Hicks type of model. All of our redistributive programs, for the most part, are predicated upon a Kaldor-Hicks model, that those who do not benefit initially will be made better off in the long run. And so our argument goes, if you're going to have tax breaks for a certain income classification, that those tax breaks will benefit those people in that income stratum, but eventually will benefit all of society, because it might get more money into the economy, so it'll benefit local businesses, and it will stimulate the economy. By stimulating the economy, then you'll be creating jobs and so on and so on. So the Kaldor-Hicks model is a lot more realistic for us in how we make public budgets, because it allows for those redistributive types of policies that usually populate our public budgets, because the vast majority of our policies and programs are going to be redistributive and or regulatory in nature. We don't have a lot of great examples of purely distributive policies where people benefit and no one else is harmed. That's a very unusual type of situation. Because again, we're dealing with taxpayer money. So the money's coming in from one segment of society and then going out to another segment of society. So these public budgets are created by who? Now, we've got a lot of individuals, a lot of actors who are involved in the public budgeting process. We have bureau chiefs, and by bureau chiefs, that's a catch-all to refer to agency directors, department secretaries, commissioners and regulatory commissions. These are the people at the top echelon of these agencies and these departments that will be creating budgets. When they create their budget requests, those budget requests then get sent to some central executive budget office. At the federal level, the executive budget office is the Office of Management and Budget, otherwise known as OMB. Here in the state of California, we have the Department of Finance that serves as our executive budget office. In a lot of reform cities, the budget office will be operated within the city manager's office. If it's in a reform city, if it's a non-reform city, then you'll have a budget office within the mayor's office. But you'll have some executive budget office that collects all these budget requests from your bureau chiefs and then puts all of these requests together into an executive budget. One of the problems we run into in the budgeting process is that the motivations of our bureau chiefs are oftentimes different than the motivations of our executive budget offices. Our bureau chiefs are motivated by trying to get more resources for their agencies and their departments. So they oftentimes engage in what's called budget maximization. So they think they may need 3% increase in their budget for next year, so they're going to ask for 5 or 6%. They're going to do that because they know that the executive budget office will probably cut it back to the 3% that they actually need. So that's budget maximization. It happens all the time in the budgeting process. To maximize your budget, sometimes bureau chiefs will engage in strategic misrepresentation, where they will ask for programs they may not really need. And there's a whole strategy, and Mike Sill goes through a lot of different strategies that are used for strategic misrepresentation. One of his favorites is the camel nose technique. And the camel nose technique, you ask for a little bit of money for a new program in 1 year, and then a little bit more the next year, and a little bit more the next year. You're getting the camel's nose under the tent. And by doing that, then you legitimize this new program that you probably wouldn't have got funded if you asked for all the money up front. That's one strategy of strategic misrepresentation. So you really have bureau chiefs and executive budget offices that are at loggerheads with each other because they have different motivations in putting this budget together. You have chief executives, the president at the federal level, governors at the state level. They have their own agendas, and their agendas are oftentimes much different than the agendas of the legislative leaders. So in Congress, you have the leaders of the parties in the Senate and the House. Here in the state of California, the legislative leaders in the Assembly and the Senate. You have legislative committees. So you have a budget committee in the House and the Senate. You have appropriations committees in the House and the Senate. You have appropriations subcommittees, 12 of them in the House and 12 of them in the Senate. You have finance committees. You have joint committee on taxation, and so on and so on. So you have legislative leaders and legislative committees that have their own motivations different than obviously the president or the governor. And then you have the myriad of interest groups who are very much involved in the budgeting process. If they get wind that their policy or their program of choice is being cut, they're going to lobby the state legislature, or they're going to lobby Congress in order to get those cuts restored. So a lot of different actors and a great variety of actors involved in the budgeting process who all have different motivations. And one we've added on in recent years, the judiciary, the courts. The courts have taken on a much more pronounced role in budgeting than they've ever had before. One way in which they've done that is through a practice known as structural remedies. Structural remedies occur when the court decides that agencies must take a certain type of action. So they will issue what used to be known as a writ of mandamus. And a writ of mandamus is an order that they're giving to an executive official or to an agency, where they will tell an agency, you must make this decision, you must do this, or else we are going to have financial penalties against you if you do not. One very high-profile example of this was in the state of Missouri several years ago, where the Missouri State Supreme Court said the system of education finance is inequitable and it violates the state constitution. And they told a school district and a school board that if you do not increase the amount of money you are spending per pupil per year, we are going to assess a fine on you for every day that you do not increase your spending. Well, the problem for that school district was in the state of Missouri, to increase taxation, you needed to have a supermajority vote. You had to have a 2/3 vote of your constituents. They weren't even able to get 50%. They couldn't even get close to a 2/3 vote. They weren't able to increase their tax rate, so they had no additional money to spend, but they were still subject to a daily fine for not spending more money per pupil per year. That type of structural remedy has direct implications for the budget of that school district. We have consent decrees that courts have also started implementing against local and state governments that also have direct fiscal implications for those state and local budgets as well. So the courts have become very involved in the budgeting process, much more so than they've ever been involved in the past. So we've got a lot of individuals and a lot of groups that are involved in public budgeting, much more so than what we might see over in the private sector. But the big difference between public and private sector budgeting really comes down to, obviously, the presence of politics. Budgeting in the public sector is very political in nature. Politics can permeate a lot of different aspects of the budgeting process. And you oftentimes hear people talk about how budgeting is all political, and they'll decry budgeting as being, it's a political process. But what do they mean when they say budgeting is all political? Well, they usually mean it in a very negative, pejorative way. But one way in which budgeting is political is in terms of the multiple reform attempts that we have tried over the past several decades to try and gain control over the budgeting process. At the federal level, the budgeting process is quite simply out of control. We don't get budgets done on time, and we don't balance our revenues and our expenditures. Every year we run larger and larger deficits. And just give you an example of that, since the year 1969, so we're in 2022 now, go back all the way to 1969. For all of those years, what's that, 53 years of budgeting, we have balanced our budget in 2 of those 53 years at the federal level. 2 out of 53. We can't balance our budget. We can't get the budget done on time by October 1st, the beginning of the new fiscal year. So we've tried to reform the process over and over and over again. And each one of those reforms, for the most part, has failed. Reform is oftentimes done for political purposes. So people can claim credit for trying to gain control over the budget process, but they simply do not work. Sometimes when people complain about the politics of budgeting, they're complaining about the incremental nature of budgeting. And one thing we will emphasize throughout this course is how incremental budgeting is. The changes to a public budget tend to be very marginal and very small from one year to the next. We typically take what we did last year and we add on 2 or 3 or 4% to keep up with inflation. Now, well, inflation's a lot more than that now, but keep up with the cost of living. And that's how we do our budgets. We don't oftentimes go back and rethink about why we're spending the money in the first place. We just keep spending a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more. So it's that incremental nature that people oftentimes don't like about the public budgeting process and what they refer to as it being political. Obviously, when they decry the political nature of the public budgeting process, they're oftentimes complaining about the domination of interest groups and just how involved interest groups are in the budgeting process. And when we talk about some of the specific reforms, probably in the next class session, because I don't think we'll have time tonight, we'll talk about some of the self-inflicted wounds that Congress inflicted upon itself with some of its reforms that actually invited interest groups in to the budgeting process and made the process even more political than it was 30 or 40 years ago. Sometimes people complain about the public budgeting process because of the process itself, but the process is so complicated and so convoluted that it's impossible for anyone to actually understand all the nuances of the federal budget process. And it's true, you have some members of Congress who have been there for 20, 30, 40 years, who will admit that they don't know all of the nuances of the federal budget process. We've made the process so complicated that people can't understand how the process works. Next time we'll talk about the federal budget process, but we'll do it in abstract, because if we were going to go through all the details of the federal budget process, it would probably be a degree program in and of itself, just to get through all those details. And when people complain about the political nature of budgeting, they're oftentimes talking about conflicts between different policy advocates and the actual debates we have between homelessness policy and funding homelessness policy versus funding food security policies or funding police activities and so on and so on. So the public budgeting process is incredibly political, and it is incredibly difficult and convoluted. We'll try and make sense of it next week, but it is a very complex process. But it is a process that is full of decision making. We make decisions throughout the entire budget process about just about every aspect of a public budget that you can think of. Public budgeting is about making decisions about revenue. We need to decide how much revenue we need to generate. We also need to decide where that revenue is coming from. Should we have a national sales tax, or should we stick with the direct federal income tax? For years, we argued about whether we should even have a federal direct income tax. Prior to the 16th Amendment, a direct individual income tax was unconstitutional. Still today, you'll hear some people say, don't pay your federal income tax. It's against the original Constitution. Well, it is against the original Constitution, but we tend to amend the Constitution. We did that with the 16th Amendment in 1913. So now the federal income tax is constitutional. But where should your money come from? Cities have these arguments as well. In 1978, we had this thing called Proposition 13. You're probably very familiar with Prop 13. The Prop 13 placed a limitation on the tax rate and the assessment rate increase that homeowners can have. So it shielded homeowners from increases in their property tax bill. But what it did is it limited the overall amount of property tax revenue that cities could generate. So what cities did in the wake of Proposition 13 is they shifted away from property taxes and they shifted more to user fees and user charges, a different source of revenue. Those are decisions that cities made in order to survive, so they could still generate revenue to pay for their expenditures. So we make a lot of revenue-based decisions. In our revenue-based decisions, we make a lot of decisions about who should pay the tax. Where should the burden be for that taxation? Should people at upper income levels pay a higher percentage than people in lower income levels? If we have something like a sales tax, should we have some commodity exemptions? So people from lower income levels don't have to pay tax on the staples of life, things like pharmaceutical drugs and things like food. Those are revenue types of decisions that we make. We make procedural decisions as well. We make decisions about how we go about passing our budget. Here in the state of California, we made some decisions recently that made it much easier to pass the state budget. For years, we struggled to get the budget through the state legislature, even though the state legislature was dominated by one party. We still had trouble getting the budget passed. In the Schwarzenegger years, if you remember back, if you're old enough to remember back to Governor Schwarzenegger, when Schwarzenegger was governor, he came into a lot of conflict with the state legislature over budget priorities. The state legislature would pass out a budget that the governor would not approve of. And the question was then, does the state have to shut down? Can state agencies still operate in the absence of a budget? Because the process was broken and we weren't able to get a budget done. Now you only need a simple majority to pass a budget through the state legislature. It used to be a supermajority, now it's only a simple majority. You still need a supermajority to increase taxes, but only a simple majority to pass the budget. Now, because of basically one party control in the state legislature and the simple majority requirement, we've been able to get budgets done not only on time, we've been able to get budgets done early. And so budgets are getting done on time here in California. They're not getting done on time at the federal level. But you make decisions about how you pass the budget, who's involved, what your deadlines are, what your requirements are. Obviously, we do a lot of decision-making in expenditures. What's our priority this year? What's our priority next year? What gets increased? What gets decreased? We make decisions about how important it is for us to balance our budget, how important it is for us to balance our revenues and our expenditures. Clearly, at the federal level, it's not all that important because we've only done it twice in the past 53 years. It's constitutionally required at the state and the local level in the vast majority of states. But how important is that balance between revenues and expenditures? In a future class, when we talk about debt and deficits, we'll talk about good debt and bad debt. Not all debt is bad. Some debt is good if you're using it for the right purposes, but we'll talk about that in a future class. And then we make decisions about implementation. How do we implement the budget? When the budget is done, and when the budget is approved, it's not over. There are still a lot of decisions that need to be made in terms of how that budget then gets implemented throughout the course of that fiscal year. So the budgeting process is all about decision making. So to help us understand how decisions are made in public budgeting, there are some accepted models in public administration for how decisions tend to be made. And some of these decision-making models you run into in courses before, you're familiar with, maybe one or two of them could be new to you. But the 4 decision-making models that we are going to focus on here in this class: rational comprehensive, incrementalism, mixed scanning, and the garbage can model of decision-making. I think those 4 decision-making models will go a long way to explaining how we create the public budgets that we create in the public sector. So the first decision-making model we sometimes see used, rarely, but we see glimmers of it in budgeting, is what's called rational comprehensive decision-making. You're probably familiar with rational comprehensive decision-making. In rational comprehensive decision-making, you clearly identify your goals and objectives. You then go out there and collect all the information on how to achieve those goals and objectives. You put together a full range of alternatives for achieving your goals. You then select the best alternative, and that best alternative then becomes the program or the policy that gets funded in your public budget. It's a very rational process. It's a very evidence-based process. You're using all the possible information that's out there. It's also a very linear process in that you identify your goals, you identify ways to achieve the goals, you select your best alternative, and you then fund that best alternative. The problem, obviously, in public budgeting for rationality is we oftentimes don't have the time, the resources, or the cognitive ability as human beings to be purely rational. We're probably not going to be able to generate all of the possible information that's out there. If you can't generate all the possible information, you're not going to be able to put together a full range of alternatives for achieving your goals. If you're not putting together a full range of alternatives, how can you say with any confidence that you are selecting the quote unquote best alternative? You probably cannot do that. So instead of rational comprehensive decision making, the dominant model of decision making oftentimes is incrementalism, which I'm sure you've covered in previous courses before. Incrementalism, making small marginal changes from one year to the next. We cannot clearly identify our goals. We don't have the cognitive ability or the time to go out there and collect all the possible information. So we cannot put together a full range of alternatives. What we will do is we'll put together a limited range of alternatives. And then we'll compare those alternatives to each other. We'll do what's called successive limited comparisons. So we'll compare alternative A to alternative B, and then alternative B to alternative C, C compared to D, A compared to D, B compared to D, and so on and so on. That's how we end up making our decisions. But we base it upon these alternatives that we thought of in a previous year and the way in which we budgeted in a previous year, and use that as a guide for how we're going to budget this year and years into the future. Clearly, the majority of budgets, especially at the local level, are done through incremental decision making. That's why each year's budget looks a lot like the preceding year. A third decision-making model is a combination of the first two, and that's what's called mixed scanning. In mixed scanning, we will be as rational as we can be for big issues. So for very important, momentous issues, we're going to be as rational as we can possibly be. But for those simple, more mundane day-to-day issues, we're not going to spend the time and money. We're going to be incremental rather than rational. So if we're making a decision about building a new city hall, we're going to try and be as rational as possible. You know, here at Cal State Long Beach, the College of Health and Human Services is constructing a brand new building. I think they're supposed to break ground on that sometime in 2023. I think it's supposed to be done sometime in 2025, I think, if I'm not mistaken. It's going to be a beautiful new building housing the majority of the departments within the college. Not us. We're not moving into the building. So we're going to kind of stay in our humble abode. But that's an example of a big decision. And so the college has been very rational in making that decision. They have been very rational in terms of the architects they hired, the footprint for the building, the types of amenities in the building, all of that has been a very rational type of protracted decision-making process. However, if you're talking about something as simple as supplies for an office, you can be very incremental. You look at what you used last year, and you then add a little bit on for the next year. That's mixed scanning. Big issues, rational; smaller issues, incremental. But a fourth decision-making model that I think explains a lot of how we make our policies and decide what policies and programs end up in our public budgets is my favorite decision-making model, and that's the garbage can model of decision-making. I hate the title of it. I think it's a terrible name because it just kind of sounds like you throw things in the garbage can, you shake it up and see what you get. I don't like the title, but I like the thought behind it. If you haven't been introduced to garbage can model decision making before, the way in which it works is that we tend to make decisions, and for our purposes here in budgeting, decisions about what to fund in our budgets at the confluence of 4 different streams. So there's what's called a participant stream, there's a problem stream, there's a solution stream, and then there's what's called a choice opportunity stream. So in your problem stream, you have all these problems out there in society that we're aware of. We have a general recognition. So yeah, we know that there is a major homelessness problem. We know there's a food insecurity problem. We know all these problems exist, and they're all floating around out there in this problem stream. You have a participant stream. The participant stream is you have the right people in place to make a decision. You've got people in place who are prepared to make a decision to try and solve this problem. They're ready to spend the money to solve that problem. So you got the right decision makers in place. There's a solution stream. That solution stream are all these possible solutions to the problems floated around in your problem stream. Now, here's where the garbage can model kind of gets into what I call the Quentin Tarantino model of decision making, in that it becomes non-sequential, it becomes non-linear, in that solutions may predate problems. In the rationality, you come up with your goal and your problem, and then you develop a solution to that problem, you fund that solution. Garbage can model, the solution can actually predate the problem. So there could have been a solution we developed 20, 30, 40 years ago for some other problem. We can take that solution and apply it to a modern day problem. So it's a non-linear way of making decisions. But that solution is probably not going to be applied to that problem by your participants unless you've got your fourth stream, which is a choice opportunity stream. A window of opportunity opens up that then allows the solution to be applied to the problem. And one example I always use for the garbage can model decision making was several years ago, there was an airline known as ValueJet. And ValueJet had one of their aircrafts go down in the Florida Everglades, unfortunately killed everyone on board. It was a tragedy, but the plane went down because of a fire that occurred in the cargo bay of that plane. The problem was that the crew was unaware of the fire in the cargo bay because there were no smoke detectors. Smoke detectors were not required at that time on those types of jets. And so by the time they knew the fire was there, it already burned through the electrical system, and the plane was not recoverable, and unfortunately it crashed. So that's an example of garbage can model decision making. You had a problem that was defined, and that problem that was defined is undetected fires in the cargo bay of planes. You had a solution, which was requiring smoke detectors. Smoke detectors weren't created as a result of the ValueJet crash. They've been around for decades, but this is applying a pre-existing solution to a problem that has become evident. You had the right participants in place, and that you had a majority in Congress that was willing to act very quickly to require these smoke detectors in the cargo bay of planes. And obviously you had this window that opened up, this tragedy that occurred that galvanized everyone's focus on requiring smoke detectors in the cargo bay of planes. And you then had a lot of money going into the federal budget for regulation to make sure that airlines were installing these smoke detectors in the cargo bay of those planes. That's an example of these streams all converging and coming together in garbage can model decision making to have an impact upon what we're prioritizing as part of our public budgets. I think when you look at how budgets are made, the vast majority of our public budgeting tends to be done through incremental decision making because we have limited time, we have limited resources, and we have limitations on our cognitive ability as human beings. So the vast majority of our budgets are incremental. But every now and then we have some glimmers of rationality, and oftentimes that comes in the form of garbage can model of decision making. You've got the right decision makers in place, you have a well-defined problem, you have a solution to apply to that problem, oftentimes a pre-existing solution, and something has happened to galvanize public opinion around the idea that we need to put our money where our mouth is. We need to put public funds behind applying the solution to try and solve this problem. And every now and then, it's that garbage can model decision making that accounts for the really big changes that we see in our public budgets, even though the vast majority of our budgets tend to be pretty static and done primarily through incremental decision making. Hold on to these 4 different decision-making models because as we proceed through the class, we're going to return to those decision-making models and we're going to point out examples where we see some rationality versus incrementalism versus garbage can model decision-making. And we're going to keep referring back to these decision-making models because our focus throughout the course will be on how we make decisions in public budgeting, how we decide what to fund, how much to spend on it, how we decide who is involved, who benefits from it. All those decisions are all part of the decision making we do in public budgeting. But in the public sector, we have a lot more decision makers and we have a lot more moving parts, the decisions that we make as compared to our private sector counterparts. Now, clearly, since it's 8:30, we can't do the budgeting process in 10 minutes. So we're going to hold off on public budgeting process until our next class session, which again will be in 2 weeks since we don't have class next Monday because of Memorial Day. So in 2 weeks, we're going to have kind of a stacked class session because we're going to do public budgeting process. We'll talk about the federal process as a guide for understanding state and local budgeting processes. We'll talk about budget formats. Now, I introduce you to line item, performance-based, program-based, and zero-based budgeting. And then if time permits, we'll then get into a discussion of how we analyze budgets and some of the primary tools that we use in analyzing budgets and the fiscal solvency of city and state government. So a big full agenda 2 weeks from tonight. If you can, please do remember that by Sunday, give me a brief introduction about yourself. And again, just anything that you feel free sharing. Then by June 5th, your first graded beach board post is due. And that's the one where you're going to go and look at the governor's budget, look at the proposed budget, 2 priorities in that proposed budget, and then look at how those priorities may have been affected by the May revise. Okay? Any questions or anything before we call an evening for our first session? As you review the syllabus and as you review this recording, any questions that emerge about any of the assignments for the class, the pre-instructional or the 2-part post-instructional, feel free to shoot me an email and I'm happy to answer any of those questions. Otherwise, I hope everyone has a great week, really 2 weeks, and then I'll see you back here in 2 weeks on, I guess it's June 6th for our next Zoom session. All right?
Sure. Hi, David, I was going to ask a quick question. Do you have the PowerPoint of this? Is it on the beach?
Yes. Yes, okay. The PowerPoint is up on our Beachboard site. Okay,
excellent. Thank you, sir.
Okay, all right. Nice seeing everyone. We'll talk a lot more in a couple of weeks and get to know you a little bit more, but talk to you again on June 6th. Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Thank you, David.
Thank you.